We're returning to the book of Joshua today, but before we get there, I want to ask you, in your own life, have there been areas of difficulty? Areas that in your spiritual life, in your walk with Christ, if you're a Christian, and maybe you're here and you're not yet, and that's fine, and this is something to maybe think about, look ahead to what it would be like. Because when we become a Christian, we might think, well, all of our problems are solved, but very quickly, oftentimes people realize that sometimes old patterns of behavior, old habits that we have renounced as destructive, as damaging to us, as sinful, that they're still tempting us in some ways or creeping back in. And sometimes these can seem like things that we can't overcome. And so there we go. I want to ask you, what strongholds, so to speak, in your life have needed to be overcome? What are some of these challenges that you faced that needed to be overcome? And I've listed a bunch of different things that in various ways are seen in the New Testament as things that can hold us back from doing what God is calling us to do, from living into the blessedness that God has in life for us. Sometimes it's fear that holds us back. Sometimes it's greed. Sometimes it's lust. Sometimes envy, arrogance, dishonesty, gossip, wanting to spread bad or negative information about other people, laziness, just holding us back from doing what we need to do to help ourselves or others, resentment, not forgiving others, wanting to be in control, picking fights, being quick to anger. And some of these you might say, oh, that's not a problem for me at all. And other ones you might go, oh, well, yeah, maybe. Or maybe not an active problem, but you understand the temptation. How difficult can it be to overcome these obstacles to living a blessed life? Now, as we've been looking at the book of Joshua, we've been applying it in a way by way of spiritual analogy. And we're going to do the same thing today. We'll talk a little bit about the story itself as well. But in Joshua, when the Israelites entered the land, they faced their first major obstacle or stronghold to taking possession of the land of promise. And that was the city of Jericho, and in particular, its walls. Now, this is not a picture of Jericho. This is a picture of the northern Israelite city of Dan from a few centuries later, but it gives you some kind of an idea, ancient building techniques. And in Jericho, the walls would have been about double this height. This is probably 10, 12 feet high, high, too high to jump over. And so in Jericho, at one point at least, there was a stone retaining wall that was about 15 feet high, and then built up on top of it, there was another wall, a mud brick wall, about another 12 feet high. So about a 30-foot wall. And like most ancient cities, Jericho would have been built on Jericho. Either this is the mound at Beth Shan in the Jezreel Valley. So it's near the Jordan River, but to the north of Jericho, a number of miles. This mound is about 3.5 acres on the top. Jericho is more like 10 acres on the top. So Jericho's larger than Beth Shan, but 10 acres still. So estimates are that probably about 2,000 people would be able to live in that area, to give you a sense of the size of Jericho as a city. And maybe a few people from the surrounding villages might have come in as well. But generally about 2,000. Now this is larger than a place the Israelites are going to go to next, Ai, but it's quite a bit smaller than the city of Hazor, which later on in the book of Joshua becomes one of their becomes in conflict with the Israelites. So we're gonna turn to the story. We pick up near the end of chapter 5. I'm not going to read this whole passage, because again, it's quite a long passage today, and some of the past parts are repetitive, but I would encourage you to do so. Before the actual scene at Jericho, there's this encounter. It says, once when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you one of us or one of our adversaries?" He replied, "Neither, but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and he said to him, "What do you command your servant, my Lord?" The commander of the army of the Lord said to, "The place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. So Joshua encounters this figure. When you're getting ready for a battle and you come across somebody who's armed, you want to know, are they on my side or the other side? And Joshua confronts this individual and finds out it's not somebody from Jericho and it's not one of the Israelites. It's somebody else altogether. Joshua is facing this battle with just two armies in mind: the army he commands and the army in the city that he's coming up against. And yet, this encounter opens his eyes to the fact that there is, in fact, a third force, a third army that is out of sight, but not inconsequential. And here it's making its presence known. You might, by the way, we're not going to look at it, but in 2 Kings chapter 6, there's a story with Elisha that also features this other army. But what's really significant in the development of events in Joshua is that this parallels in some way the events with Moses leading up to the Exodus. This is in some way Joshua's burning bush experience, where he encounters a representative of God. Or some questions, who is this figure exactly? We're not going to dig into that today. But this is an encounter. You get the idea of it being a holy place, having to take off his shoes. There are all these parallels that remind us of what happened with Moses. And so again, we're seeing this pattern. As it was with Moses, so now with Joshua. A different situation, but the same pattern. And so now, Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out, and no one went in. So this is what you would expect in a siege situation. It's not a pitched battle on the open field. Instead, the people of Jericho are preparing for a siege. But the emphasis on the gate being shut. Maybe we should ask another question here. What would have happened if Jericho, instead of shutting its gates against the Israelites, had said, "Welcome"? Now that may be hard to imagine, given certain other things going on at the time. But in fact, as we saw in chapter 2, when two of the Israelites did come to Jericho before, they were welcome. That had been the case with the whole city. It's hard to say. Does being shut reveal a choice not only to oppose the Israelites, but even to be enemies of the Lord? The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets when they make a long blast with the ram's horn. And as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the walls of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead." So these are the instructions Joshua is receiving from this messenger, this figure. I'm not going to read the entire battle relation, which is going to talk about doing all of this with a little bit of extra detail. But one of the things to notice here is that this way of laying siege to the city is more of a ceremony than a battle tactic, right? And in particular, this focuses on the Ark of the Covenant, which is representative of God's presence with the Israelites. We've already seen it played an important role in crossing the Jordan. And now the Ark circling the city takes center stage. And what this signals is that the actual opponent of the city of Jericho is not the Israelite army, but the Lord. You maybe heard the old song. When I was a kid, they used to sing it in Sunday school. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. But the point here is that it's actually the Lord that fights the battle of Jericho, not Joshua. And here the Lord is announcing in advance that he's going to win, what he's going to do. But he's also inviting Joshua and the Israelites, or asking them, commanding them really, to participate in this victory by following what God says. So we're skipping ahead a little bit here. As I said, I'm not going to walk through the entire battle sequence which follows the instructions that we just read. I'd encourage you to do that. But at the end, we get at dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. At the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Now, one detail I didn't read, but is in the passage before, is that up until this point, the people were supposed to be silent. The ram's horn, the shofar, blows occasionally, but the people are not to speak. It's a silent ceremony until this point. There's this suspense, and then there is this shout. Now, we might expect that immediately after this we're told what happens, but no, now we get some additional context, some additional description that adds a certain kind of suspense, but also explains what's about to happen. And Joshua says, "The city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers we sent. As for you, keep away from the things devoted to destruction, so as not to covet and take any of the devoted things, and make the camp of Israel an object of destruction, bringing trouble upon it." Remember that. We're going to come back to it next week. "But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." Now, the instructions Joshua is giving here are instructions to implement what was commanded in Deuteronomy. For instance, in verses 20, 16 to 18, it says, "But as for the towns of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them, just as the Lord your God has commanded, so that they may not teach you to do all the abhorrent things they do for their gods, and you thus sin against the Lord your God." So, in Deuteronomy, this is being proposed as a necessary measure because these people, as Deuteronomy says, are in some ways an existential threat to the people of Israel. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown, and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. This dramatic moment. The walls come down. Now, the only natural force that we could imagine doing this is something like an earthquake. It happens in connection with the shout, and it says, "Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys." And again, this is what Joshua and Deuteronomy had commanded, but understandably, many people read this today and they are shocked by what happens here. They're horrified that it's not only the soldiers, but pretty much everybody, we'll see there's an exception, but is put to death. And so, of course, if something like this were in the news today, it would be widely condemned. It would be considered a war crime, an atrocity. And even within the Old Testament, these aren't, even within Deuteronomy, these are not the normal rules for warfare. It's an exceptional case. And that's important to say because there are no, if we read this story, one thing we should not understand it to be is a model for how we're to conduct ourselves against people who are opposed to us. It's not that. There are no biblical grounds for imitating what the Israelites did at this time. Now, the idea that's articulated here in this passage is that this kind of destruction is something that only God has the authority to command. That is, no person, no leader can just say, "Oh, I'm going to do this." Right? No human could have or could ever have the authority to do this. The second emphasis is that the Lord is the one fighting. And because the Lord wins the battle, what is won belongs to the Lord. And in this case, that God has pronounced a death sentence, the judgment that belongs to God alone, on the enemies that God conquers. And as a result, the Israelites are not able to profit from anything they find in the city. They are not to take what belongs to God. Now, one of the challenges is that this is something that it's very difficult to understand this. And so, whatever we make of these claims, when we read them within the whole of Scripture, particularly as Christians, we have to read them as standing in some way in light of what God has done for us through Jesus Christ on the cross. And in particular, remember that the cross is the primary symbol, the primary sign of how God treats his enemies. That the Son of God gives his life to provide forgiveness for the enemies of God. And so then, for Christians, the cross becomes the model for how we face both God's enemies and ours. That we leave final judgment to God. Maybe think of Jericho perhaps as a symbol of final judgment, but leave this to God. In fact, in the New Testament period, those who would try to act as if they were to imitate the stories in Joshua are in fact those who are setting the nation of Israel on a course to ruin in the first century. Something that Jesus warns about and certainly the apostles don't emulate. Now, even in Joshua, some of the people within Jericho were spared. They become part of God's people. So Joshua said to the men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of it and all who belong to her as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab out along with all her kindred and set them outside the camp of Israel. So here we see that this is not like, that there are people who survive this. There are people who are rescued. And actually, as we'll see, although they're set outside the camp initially, they are going to be integrated into the people of Israel. And it says, "And then they burned down the city and everything in it, only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord." Now, one question we may have is, well, wait a minute, we know where Joshua is, we know where the mound of Joshua is, there's been archaeological work that's done there. Is there evidence for what we have recorded? Now, the answer to that is, it's controversial. There is an interesting, somewhere in the middle of the second millennium BC, there was a time when the upper wall of Jericho collapsed and fell down, and in fact fell down in such a way that the rubble from the upper wall could have acted as a ramp up the lower wall. And on top of that, there is a burn layer where the city was burned. It was destroyed. One of the interesting details with the burning also is that they found significant supplies of grain that were burned when the city was burned, which tells us two things. One is that the siege wasn't very long because the grain had not been eaten. And second of all, it tells us that the people who burned the city didn't take the grain, which is kind of strange. Now, there's some controversy about the particular dating of this and whether it fits the Israelite time frame. There's those who say so. There's others who say, well, there was another example of this later on, and we just don't know about it yet because there's been a lot of erosion in part of Jericho, and so we may never know exactly. There's a lot of debate, but it is interesting. It's suggestive. So to come back to the story, again, it's interesting to notice that twice the passage emphasizes the people who are not put to death, the people who were inhabitants of Jericho who survive and become part of the people of Israel. But Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, Joshua spared. Her family has lived in Israel ever since, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. She welcomed the messengers, the spies, the scouts. She allowed them to live. She protected them at cost and risk to herself. And as a result, Joshua and the Israelites allow her and her whole family to live and become part of their people. This is the end of chapter 6, the end of our passage for today. It says, Joshua then pronounced this oath, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be anyone who tries to build this city, this Jericho, at the cost of his firstborn's gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. A leader's first military conquest was often considered very important, very decisive in terms of establishing leadership. So the fact that Joshua's first military conquest is successful increases his reputation. Notice this curse on Jericho is interesting. Presumably the reason for it is that for Jericho to be uninhabited, for it to be a burnt ruin, is an enduring sign to anyone who passes by of what happened there. However, Jericho would be rebuilt several centuries later, and there's a note in 1 Kings 16 about what happens when that happens. We're not going to look at that today. As we think about how we apply what we do with a passage like this, we can think about the history, we can think about the ethics of what the Israelites did, of whether that can be justified. Those are important debates, but as I've said, there's no way, and we shouldn't, in fact, apply what the Israelites did to our own ethics in any kind of a direct way. Instead, what the New Testament does is it uses warfare language to talk about something else entirely. It seems to use this imagery from Joshua and elsewhere as a kind of analogy for our spiritual life. And we've done this throughout, thinking about how just as the Israelites crossed the Jordan, so when we enter into salvation by faith and enter the promised land, there are still challenges, still battles to be fought, so to speak. And in the New Testament, we see that as Christians, our battle to inherit the promised land of living in blessed communion with God and one another, that's the goal, right? Love of God, love of others. This often involves a war that takes place within our own hearts. For instance, in 1 Peter 2:11, it says, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul." The idea being there are temptations that are in our fallen humanity, in our fallenness, we are subject to, but that there is more at stake than we might think in this battle within. Also in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says, "We do not wage war according to human standards, for the weapons to destroy strongholds." Now notice that's kind of similar language as you might think of to the Joshua scene. "We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ." So if we think about the heart, we're thinking about the will. But if we think about the thought, we're talking about the mind, right? I mean, the idea is what we think, what we choose, what we want, what we desire, what we love. There's a battle. Will we give this over to Christ? Or will we give in to the forces that wage war against our soul? Because the New Testament also says that this war for our hearts is part of a larger cosmic conflict. Interestingly, not against other human beings, For our struggle is not against enemies of flesh and blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Wow, that sounds pretty heavy, right? So when we think about this war against these destructive desires within us, spiritual enemies as well, we may feel like we imagine the people in Joshua may have felt, like we're facing this wall that can't be scaled, that we don't have it within ourselves to overcome this stronghold, to overcome this obstacle. And we may try and feel like we're just walking around in circles, just looking at the problem. But in fact, the battle has already been won. And we are able to receive the victory in faith as we act on our marching orders, on how God tells us to meet the problem. One passage, this is our memory verse for today, about the battle being won. It says, "He," that is Jesus, "disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in the cross." Now, interestingly, this is a reversal of what a crucifixion would have been expected to be. A crucifixion was meant by the Romans to be an example of their domination, their destruction of anyone who would oppose them, or who anyone could have even been suspected of opposing them. But on the contrary, Paul says, in fact, because they put him to death and God raised him from the dead, it exposes the impotence of the powers of evil to even use death as a weapon. And so interestingly, in 1 Corinthians 15, where this famous passage where Paul's talking about the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of the body, our resurrection, he says, "He," that is Christ, "must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet." The last enemy to be destroyed is death. So Christ has won the victory, he's reigning, but this victory is still to be fully implemented in our lives and in our world. It's underway. How do we do this? "For the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God conquers the world, and this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith." So when we trust God enough to do what he's asking us to do, this is an exhibition of our love for God, our love for others. It's only possible because Christ has already won the victory and is working by the Spirit to work that victory out in our lives. What's up to us is to say, "Yes, Lord," and to take that step forward to obey, even if it feels like we're just walking around in circles. To know that doing what he says will bring the walls down. It'll bring the walls down. And we're going to receive that deliverance because he is faithful and he has won the victory. Let's pray together.